Today I'm going to show you how to make a skull out of a yoga mat, specifically a venom skull. Let's get started! For this build, I use white EVA foam floor mats, white craft foam, white EVA foam clay, putty, super glue, hot glue, sharpening stone, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I'm going to use this template that I made to make the basic skull before I modify it into a venom specific skull. You can find a link to this pattern in the description down below, as well as all my other patterns. I traced most of the pieces onto 3/8 inch thick EVA foam floor tiles, but for the jaw, teeth, and bridge of the nose pieces, I used craft foam. Typically I use a black marker for foam tracing. However, I don't typically work with white foam, and the black marker will soak right in and get absorbed. And once it's in the foam, it's very difficult to get back out. So, in order to keep the trace lines from showing, I'm going to use a pencil instead. Although I suppose if you were going for a buried in the earth for hundreds of years look, then brown Sharpie might aid in weathering. I don't know, food for thought. Most of these pieces represent only one side of the skull, so I labeled the side and orientation directly onto the foam before cutting the pieces out. I also made sure to add registration marks so that I could line up the pieces later. I cut the pieces out with my razor pen, but occasionally I was able to get away with using scissors. You could do the whole thing with scissors. There's nothing stopping you. Well, I don't know your situation, I'm assuming. But using scissors could lead to some unnecessary sanding. Yeah, the razor pen is more precise, but it's almost too precise. Because it's theoretically possible to avoid sanding altogether with the razor pen, but most people, myself included, do not have machine precision in our casual motion. I have horrible script. My writing, I failed a math test once because my ones look like sevens. But if your blade's sharp enough and there's any sort of variation in just the way you're holding the razor pen, you could end up with a beveled cut and that'll mess up your seam. So you should always plan to clean it up on a belt sander or with a rotary tool. In order to get the opposite side, I simply flipped the template over and traced it again. If you're starting from a fresh sheet of EVA foam, then with all the extra surface area, it could be helpful to tape it to the surface and flip it along a symmetrical dividing line so that a small portion of the left side remains attached to the right side, thus eliminating a little bit of seam and strengthening the connection between each side, like what I'm doing with the faceplate. However, for the center seam of the skull, at least for the top, that's actually a thing on real skulls. Skulls are made of plates that are designed to compress because of science reasons. I did my research. Nah, I didn't. I cut that out as well. It'll look a little goofy for a while with all the eye and nose holes clustered like that, but trust me, it'll all make sense in the end. The thickness of the floor mats will make sculpting the bridge of the nose unnecessarily difficult later on, so instead I'm using craft foam left over from BD1, a stormtrooper? I don't know, something white. Next I made the palette. It's pretty straightforward. It helps to think of this as an upside down ice cream cone or an engine belt, just to get an idea of its shape. When all the pieces were cut out, I smoothed out the edges on my belt sander so that they line up better. It's important that the edges are flat so that the seam is flat. Then I heat formed each piece with my heat gun. This will make it more malleable. It is possible to burn the foam, and the burns will show up much more prominently on white EVA foam than they would on the standard gray, so err on the side of caution while you're doing this. Typically, I do most of the heat forming on the pattern side because that's usually on the inside and out of sight, and I only really do enough on the external side to seal it up, to get that texture change when it seals up. When the pieces were good and hot, I pressed them into a curved shape using a pasta sauce planishing iron, which is totally a thing that I made out of all my epoxy resin failures. I was trying to keep them out of the landfills and the oceans. I'm a hero. That's what I'm saying, is I'm a hero. I'm kidding, I hate nature. If outside was so great, we wouldn't have invented inside. I weighted that down with a metal machinist block, but any weight will do, really. This may seem like a lot of work when you can just buy a novelty Halloween skull and modify it, but trust me, you don't want to deal with that. They're almost always too small and misshapen. And if you try to cut into them with an X-Acto knife, the blade tends to swerve, making it impossible to follow any sort of planned out cut. If you try to saw into them or sand them, the dust that it's going to kick up ends up being 1,000 times worse than EVA dust. Seriously, it's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. It's basically sand. I set the pieces into a bowl underneath metal weights for them to cool. By cooling in a curved shape, the pieces will retain a curved shape. When they had cooled, I glued the pieces together, starting with the darts. Normally I use contact cement for this, but it has this yellowish khaki color that will show up really obviously against the white EVA foam, which might not be a problem if you're going to give this a specific paint scheme, like a buried in the sand for 1,000 years, and then the colors will blend. Or you could even cover it up with white plastidip. But the weather's not good for painting right now, where I am, so super glue. After each half was finished, I glued them together. Then I glued in the faceplate, being sure to attach the cheekbones to the sides, not the edge. I know it is a little counterintuitive because you start off attaching the forehead to the edges, but as you travel down the sides of the head, those gotta go on the outside. Just look at an actual skull for reference. You know, because we all have those lying around. After each half was finished, I glued them together. Then I heat formed the teeth. Teeth mounting plate, it's a palette, but it's also other structures, I don't know. This will take much less time than the other parts as it's a thinner foam. I glued a palette into it using regular thickness foam in order for it to hold its shape better. I added some hot glue for reinforcement. Then I sliced bevels, diagonals, into the converging edges, the cheekbones, so that it would line up better with the palette, and glued it in. Then to reinforce it a bit, I hot glued these shims into the underside of the cheekbones. To make the divider in the nose, septum? Is that the septum? Sure. I cut up a piece of craft foam and sanded the outward-facing edge of it until it was rounded. I glued it on top of the palette. Then I glued in the bridge of the nose. This will almost certainly need refinement, just saying. Then I made the jawbone, which is super easy. L bracket, flip it. I rounded its edges with my rotary tool. I also gave the skull a once over. The dome was pretty good. These were some of my better seams, but the cheekbones needed pretty bad. After I had rounded them off, I used Alex Fast Dry putty to fill in the corners that I couldn't reach. I also went over all the seams with putty. Some of these seams will require multiple passes, but the putty needs at least 20 minutes to dry. So I took a break, just chilled for a bit. When it had had a chance to dry, I took a stab at the eyes. It's horrible imagery. Originally, I cut them out beveled, but that turned out not to be necessary. They actually would have been perfect if I just cut them out straight. But I'm not trying to make just a regular old skull from any ordinary human. This was actually a patron request from DS Ryder, and he specifically requested this to be a Venom skull, as not seen in an alternate ending to Spider-Man 3. Super specific. So, Topher Grace Venom. Essentially, there was supposed to be this scene where Spider-Man tries to save Eddie from the symbiote, and all that's left of him is this mutated skull. And I guess that was just too graphic for Sam Raimi. Nah, that was a studio decision. Sam Raimi would have been all for it. That sounds like Sam Raimi put that in the script. Yeah, it's got Sam Raimi written all over it. My point is, I have to make the eyes sort of flare out a bit in that venomish, swoopy villain eyes. So, first I chopped out some material with scissors just to reduce the amount of dust that this is going to create, and then I sanded the rest of it with my rotary tool. When I was satisfied with those edges, I gave them a once-over with putty. This fills in some of the sanding grooves, but really it's more to get the bridge of the nose to blend with the rest of the skull than anything else. Then, I used white EVA foam clay to make the teeth. I shaped the foam blob into a sort of triangular candy corn type shape. Candy corn! Somehow worse than regular corn. Be a terrible spokesman. Then I wetted the surface of the skull. A little bit of water will act like a glue for foam clay, and then I stuck the teeth on one by one. Once they were stuck on, I twisted the ends to form a point. I did the same thing with the jaw. Foam clay will shrink a little bit as it dries, so try to keep that in mind. Maybe make the teeth just a little bit bigger. But really, Venom is like morphing all over the place, so you can easily make that excuse if anybody brings it up. That'll allow you a little leeway. Also, it can take days to dry out fully, but it should be ready to handle again in just a few hours. Sort of dries from the outside in. I rolled a blob into a long strand of pasta and spread that out over the tops of the teeth in order to make a more organic looking structure, so the teeth look like they're resting in sockets, not simply glued onto a flat surface. I also used the foam clay to bulk out the cheekbones, making them more menacing and vampiric. Additionally, I used it as gap filler underneath the skull. Not really something that would be seen by a lot of people, but it was nagging at me, Again, I did the same thing to the jawbone. This is already starting to dry out, and it's kind of expensive, relatively speaking. So I'm gonna flatten it, which will reduce the surface area, and hopefully what's gonna happen is the outside layer is what's gonna dry out. I can just peel that off and dig in to the gooey center next time I need it. Then I set up the pieces on an old camera tripod to dry. I ended up doing a little bit of spot touch-up with putty on a few seams between the clay foam and regular foam. These seams weren't originally there. This is a result of the foam clay shrinking as it dries. I let that dry out a bit, and that was it. That's how I made an EVA foam Venom skull. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really want to thank my patrons for this build in particular. This sort of build is only possible because of them. Because in this day and age, the algorithm is basically the elementary school teacher who calls a parent-teacher conference on you for drawing skulls and swords in class. Drawing swords and skulls doesn't mean you're troubled. Maybe swords and skulls are just cool. Grew up in a bit of a conservative area. So if you enjoyed this build and would like to see more videos like this where I don't have to adhere to the ad revenue deities, then you can check out the links in the description down below for patron channel services, such as early uploads and limited ads. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving the video quality and shop equipment, as well as allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you on the channel. Alright, hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of the future uploads, because there's more of them lately, but it's kind of at a totally random schedule. And let me know what other props you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Thanks again, happy crafting, see you later!